Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Connolly, and I am the Head of Member Services for AgencyIQ here at Politico. It's so nice to be with you today, and thank you so much for joining us. For those who have joined us before, welcome back. It is wonderful to have you with us today, and special hello to our current clients who are joining us on the line. For those who are not familiar, welcome to AgencyIQ. Just to provide a little bit of context for what you are seeing today, Politico launched AgencyIQ in January of 2020 as a regulatory intelligence service aiming to simplify, monitor, and provide impactful and insightful analysis on the FDA to regulatory affairs professionals in the life sciences industry. Our goal is first to increase the capacity of our clients by monitoring the FDA on a daily basis and tracking each guidance, new rule, update coming out of the FDA and analyzing the historical background, context, latest news, and of course, the future impacts that each development will have on the industry. Second, we seek to decrease the challenges that come with translating what is happening at the FDA for your key stakeholders or clients. And third, what you will see and experience today, enabling our clients to lift up out of the weeds and feel more proactive by hearing our analysis live and interacting with our researchers on key trends that our team is seeing. We're thrilled to let our current clients know that 2021 is a year of growth for us. We're exploring several different avenues of expansion in order to continue to provide value to your team. If you are not currently a client but are interested in learning more about AgencyIQ and exploring subscription options, you will find my email at the bottom of each slide as well as at the end of the presentation, and myself or someone from my team can touch base with you directly. Thank you again for joining. We're so glad to have each of you with us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alec to take it from here.
Fantastic, and thanks, Colleen. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. For those of you who have joined us in the past for our webinars, welcome back. For anyone attending for the first time, it's great to have you here. If you knew some of the technological difficulties we've been having this morning, we're glad to be here too. This webinar is going to be, I think, a little bit different than what we've done in the past. I think those of you who have joined us in the past know that a lot of our webinars focus on what the FDA has done recently. And the beginning of this year has been a little bit atypical for the agency insofar as Joe Biden came into office and there's been all but a regulatory freeze enacted on many new guidance documents, regulations, and policies, which is not to say that there isn't a lot going on and a lot to take notice of. So today we wanted to focus in on something we've been hearing a lot from our current clients and folks that we talk to, and that is, how is the pandemic changing what the FDA is doing? How it's going to be working, the policies and actions that it's going to be taking in the months and years ahead. And that's really what we want to focus on today. We want to kind of think about things in two ways. One is, where is the FDA now? What has it done during the pandemic? And how does that set it up to change even more in the coming months? There are lots of things that are going to happen in the near term, in the medium term, and the far term. And I think it's imperative for regulatory professionals to be thinking about these things from a regulatory strategic kind of approach. If you can know where the FDA is headed and where the next problems are likely to pop up, that makes your job easier because it allows you to plan in advance for some of the things that are going to be a headache and maybe avoid that headache altogether, or at least, and we know this is far more common, alleviate the size of that headache, because regulatory is nothing if not profoundly challenging and consistently so. So I've got some of my great AgencyIQ research colleagues on the line with me today. We've got Laura D'Angelo, who leads up medical device and diagnostic regulatory issues for us. We've got Kirsten Mesmer, who's one of our newest team members, who's an expert in biologics regulation, both here in the US and abroad. We've got Lily Rosenfield, who is a research analyst for us and is an expert on many of the data elements of how the FDA approves new products. And due to technical difficulties, we may have Kades Tedesi, who is our head of drug and biologic regulatory research here at AgencyIQ, but she seems to be having some technological difficulties. So TBD if we'll have her, but we have a great presentation for you all the same. So we also want to avoid reading from slides to the extent that we can. So we're going to be doing a little bit of a Q&A style presentation today. And we're going to start off with Laura. But before we begin, I also want to invite you, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them to us throughout the presentation. We've got a Q&A kind of module in the GoToWebinar meeting thing. Send those our way. We'll try and answer them. If not during the presentation, then at the end, we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. So Laura, let's bring you in here and talk a little bit about what we've seen with diagnostics. And certainly this past year has been nothing short of amazing in terms of the volume of emergency use authorization requests that the FDA has received and the speed with which the FDA has been trying to clear some of the backlog that it's had. Laura, my question for you is, as we've seen a year pass with the pandemic, how is the FDA shifting its focus, and what are some of the problems we're likely to see in the next few months or maybe the next year?
Amazing is certainly one word for it. So we do have kind of an absolutely unprecedented amount of emergency use authorizations that are currently listed at the FDA. There are over 300 specifically for diagnostic tests and accessories like collection kits. As we've really seen a transition in the FDA, we've seen first that the priority was getting these products onto the market kind of as quickly as possible at a very breakneck speed. And then kind of after the fact, products taken off as standards have changed, including limits of detection testing, or even submission standards, and products that have or have not submitted an emergency use authorization. So we have seen an initial focus on getting things to the market that is slowing into a pulling things off the market, but still a very breakneck speed, especially for priority tests, which include at this time at-home tests and things that don't need a clinical laboratory.
Mm-hmm. And Laura, you were mentioning kind of that removal of products from the market. Let's explore that a little bit more. It seems to me that early on in the pandemic, the only devices that were being removed from the market are those that had safety or performance issues. And to be fair, there weren't a ton of them, but there is a growing list now. It seems though in the next year, we're going to see a transition from an approach in which we see things only taken off for like serious safety or performance issues to one that may have some different interplays depending on how products are approved or if there are still EUAs. Can you walk me through that process?
Absolutely. So we have been talking in the FDA space about the transition away from emergency authorities at this point for a few months. So currently things authorized under an EUA have a different regulatory bar than a product that would be given a full market access decision. So there is a movement towards shifting away from the EUAs and into full market access, which for diagnostics would require first a de novo and then a follow-on 510K for every product that has already had an EUA. So diagnostics industry will remember we had a 90-day surge in the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics and Radiological Health that was intended to really help clear the backlog and help the agency get ahead of, as Alec was talking about, the sheer volume of EUA requests. And just that hasn't necessarily worked out. We are still in the midst of that 90-day surge that started in December. And as a reminder, all of these products that have been granted an EUA will need to be reconsidered for full market access under any kind of transition plan, which will create, I can't even say a second surge if we're still in the middle of our first. Alec, you appear to be muted.
I am indeed, and I wonder aloud if FDA is going to have the capacity to re-review all of those 510Ks as they come in, and also how many companies are really going to want to go through that process, especially if the size of the market as the pandemic winds down winds up being smaller. Lots of different variables, lots of downstream effects for other companies that have seen their products kind of on a waiting list. Laura, another question I had is kind of early on in the pandemic, I feel like FDA's response from a diagnostic perspective was a little bit of hair on fire, running around trying to, figure things out as they went along. It seems like, though, reading what CDRH Director Jeff Shuren and OHD7 Director Tim Stenzel have been talking about recently, they want to go toward a more methodical, thought-out process in the year ahead, not just for SARS-CoV-2, but for any future pandemics as they might arise. Can you walk me through how they're thinking about things, what sort of approaches they're considering?
Absolutely. So as we saw in this current pandemic, which is obviously unprecedented in our times, we have more EUAs than we've ever had in history. A learning experience out of that is that maybe, according to Shuren and Stenzel, who have been speaking very publicly and publishing lots of articles about this, a approach for the future would be to have fewer individual tests. So public-private partnerships established in advance, and rather than individual sponsors, manufacturers, diagnostic developers submitting maybe 1 up to 3 individual tests, but rather have fewer individual tests that would be performed at a higher capacity in a high throughput system that would allow for increased access to testing, which is certainly a priority of this administration, and then also ensure long-term quality of these tests, especially as clinical laboratories maybe are only running 1 or 2 tests at a time and therefore only need to know how to run 1 or 2 tests.
Capacity is a big issue during the pandemic, and perhaps a great segue into our next section here, which is staffing and capacity. The FDA has dealt with a lot during the pandemic. That is not going to be going away anytime soon. I think what we're seeing right now is that across the FDA, whether it's CDRH or CDER, FDA staff have been pulled from their normal duties into operational duties that are in some cases unfamiliar to them, especially in CDRH, as with normal device staff being pulled into diagnostic reviews, even within CDER, where lots of different review staff are being pulled in to review INDs or some of these new virologic products. That's causing downstream effects, again, for companies as their normal reviewers. Maybe if they're not pulled off their products entirely or the reviews entirely, it's taking them longer to do things. And we're seeing just a lot of staff capacity issues as the result of that. What we're not going to see is a light switch turn and all of a sudden the pandemic's over and FDA is back to normal. Rather, it's going to be a little bit more like a dimmer switch, if you can imagine that. It's going to go from pitch black slowly back to light being the normal situation here. And it's going to have some bumps and starts there, depending on what's going on with the pandemic. Certainly, if the entirety of the US population gets vaccinated, things, vaccines work exceptionally well against new variants, we'll see a return to normal more quickly than otherwise. On the other hand, if things maybe don't go as well, maybe only 60 to 70% of the population gets vaccinated, new variants mean that existing vaccines aren't as effective as they ought to be, we may see kind of a long tail for the FDA here. Now, kind of exploring that first thing I was talking about more, where some products for COVID-19 are being prioritized at the expense of others, including borrowing from staff capacity or just it's no longer first in, first out, but it's whenever the COVID-19 product that can help the most people comes in, that's first out. FDA is likely to continue this for the foreseeable future. And again, those downstream effects start to be a little bit of a broken record there, but it's going to continue to have effects there. And especially in the diagnostic space, if you call into the CDRH's weekly town hall meetings, there are people on there who quite literally will scream at FDA folks saying, my product has been under review for months and nothing has happened with it. My non-COVID-19 product that is a diagnostic for a different thing, maybe it's a companion diagnostic, is not being reviewed. There are a lot of companies now which have their commercial operations on hold, and it's going to take a long time, I'm sorry to say, for that to get back to normal. Now, this last part here is, I think, less frequently thought of by folks in industry, but is no less important. And that is that FDA staff during this year, much like many of the rest of us, have been working really, really hard. Long hours, frequent weekends. And it's, I think, on one hand, they are working in service of a mission, and many of them, as they'll tell you, are deeply proud of the work that they're doing in helping the United States respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other hand, though, it's exhausting, and it would not surprise me if many of the staff over at FDA are, again, like the rest of us, feeling a little bit burnt out, feeling like, you know what, maybe it's time for a job change at the end of this year. And that could mean a huge brain drain as people leave the agency, that they no longer, feel like they're earning their current market potential, and maybe they want to go work for industry or work in academia. So that means that we could see some challenges with product reviews, again, maybe being delayed or impacted negatively by a lack of FDA resources. It takes a very long time to train FDA review staff up to the level of competency where they can be maximally effective. The other thing, and I haven't heard this talked about, so this is pure speculation on my part, but in the past few years, what we've heard from FDA is the importance of organizing around certain principles for the purposes of reviewing products more efficiently. We've seen that with the Oncology Center of Excellence. We've heard that with the Compounding Quality Center of Excellence. There have been proposals for a Neurodegenerative Diseases Center of Excellence. There was one this week. You may have read about an FDA Today or newsletter on a Rare Disease Center of Excellence. Maybe we see a COVID-19 Center of Excellence insofar as it's affecting all three major medical product centers for devices, biologics, and drugs. Maybe this is an area where they start working together. And since this is going to be an issue for quite a long time, maybe it's a temporary center of excellence or something like that. So one thing to watch there. Now, moving ahead, I want to bring in my colleague, Lily Rosenfield, to talk a little bit about the speed at which the FDA has been moving here, because Lily, I think it's plain to see for most folks, FDA has been moving pretty quickly during the pandemic to review products. I think the speed at which they've actually been moving is quite surprising insofar as it's just been unbelievably quickly. Can you contextualize some of what we've been seeing and talk about, how fast are they actually moving here?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see on this slide, 365 days, that is a typical review cycle for NMEs going through CDER for priority review, slightly shorter at 240, but Veklury, a therapeutic for COVID-19, was approved in 76 days. So for a little bit of context, when we're looking at this by the numbers, only 5 other NMEs approved by CDER, one of which being Veklury, in the last 10 plus years have been reviewed in under 100 days. 2 of those were oncology indications, and all 4 of the additional products outside of Veklury were rare disease products. So this is incredibly, incredibly rare, and like Alex said, super unprecedented. So really what we're seeing so far, at least for this one COVID therapeutic that has been approved through the standard process, is a model and a timeline that works a little bit more similarly to the real-time oncology review program, or RTOR, rather than this even typical priority review timeline. It's much, much, much faster, and in some cases the FDA, similar to RTOR, being able to review things prior to the date of filing.
And Veklury, by the way, for anyone on the call who isn't aware, that is the brand name of remdesivir, which you probably heard talked about a lot early on in the pandemic. Kirsten, I want to bring you in here too, because as Lily was talking about the timeline of review, I think what other regulatory folks have reached out and kind of noted correctly is the timeline of review is a little bit flexible here. And actually what the FDA has been doing is not necessarily reviewing these products for dramatically less time. Rather, it's been kind of shifting the review window to much earlier on. Can you talk about how we've seen that manifested in, say, emergency use authorization reviews?
Definitely, I can. So, yeah, Veklury was approved very quickly, as well as the vaccines. We know that Pfizer, the Comirnaty vaccine, was approved in 22 days, which is closely matched by Moderna's 18 days and Pfizer's 24 days. But please keep in mind that most of these vaccines already were talking to the FDA, and most of the data was already under rolling review. In the US, the sponsors don't have to make that information available, that the data is actually with FDA and that they're talking to FDA. Versus in other jurisdictions, they may have to, or the regulatory agency might make that available. One of the best examples is the European Medicines Agency that has taken a step to being very transparent during this time of COVID-19. And for example, for Comirnaty, we know that has been on the rolling review for 55 days before it was even announced that it was had the full application, which took, again, 22 days. Like it is in the US. So that adds up to 77 days. It's still a lot shorter than the 100 days that we've been seeing, but still, please keep in mind that the regulatory agency have been looking at this data for a longer time than just these 22 days. And they're very keen on making sure that these vaccines are safe and efficacious. But it begs the question, will there be an option to move faster, like during COVID-19, with products for diseases where there are no approved treatments.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point there, Kirsten, and a perfect segue into our next slide here. During Warp Speed, Operation Warp Speed, the FDA and industry have been moving at, as the name implies, really, really fast speeds to get product development done, crunching what is very often a 10-year process with very high rates of failure. I think about 66% of vaccines that enter into phase 1 clinical testing do not ultimately go on to get approved. We have multiple approved vaccines. We've gotten very lucky. What question kind of comes up for me is, as we've seen with the FDA's Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program and other accelerating measures that are in some ways based on the FDA's Real-Time Oncology Review pilot program, it may be difficult for the FDA to kind of reset expectations following the pandemic and say, well, that was a really special case. We can't normally move that quickly, when we know that the FDA in some cases can move that quickly for example, oncology products. So I think there's going to have to be that weird period of kind of resetting expectations where the FDA will need to make clear, listen, this is the normal amount of staffing resources it takes to review something that quickly. Here are the trade-offs that we make in doing so. And that conversation is going to have to be very, very acute, I think, with Congress in particular, who does not necessarily deal in nuance when making legislation. If Congress all of a sudden says, why aren't you reviewing all products in 90 days like you did for remdesivir, that's going to be very challenging for the FDA to implement. Kirsten, to bring you back in here as well, we've seen, actually, let me quickly check. Cadest, are you able to get your audio working? I don't think we are. Unfortunately, Cadesta was going to speak to some of our vaccine stuff. So Kirsten, who just wrote a really fantastic piece for us looking at how vaccines are regulated around the world, is, I think, able to step in and talk about this, as am I. But Kirsten, we've seen 3 vaccines that have been granted an emergency use authorization so far. Can you talk to me a little bit about what's coming up next? Because we've heard some companies talking about, well, it's not just EUA and done. Rather, they want that full approval, the full biologics license application and licensure that comes along with that. What does that mean for companies, and what are they starting to think about here?
Well, the FDA has always encouraged companies to start with a full approval in mind, even though they're going for the EUA, because that's the fastest way to get the vaccine on the market. But of course, that's not the end of the road, because they do have to get, ultimately, they do have to get full approval, because once the emergency is called over, the EUA isn't valid anymore. That's for the US, and that's for global EUAs. But some countries like Europe and Australia, those vaccines have been fully approved on a conditional basis, more or less. They're renewable for the European Union after a year, for Australia it's after 2 years. So companies have to really keep in mind how those vaccines are approved in the market they're looking at. And of course, we want to have them globally, so they need to look at everything globally and need to make sure they fulfill the requirements. For the US, the FDA requires at least 6 months follow-up. So we are hoping that probably by May we are seeing the first vaccines trying to apply for full approval. The other one, of course, that's still in the padlock is the AstraZeneca vaccine. And it will be very interesting to see what's happening with that vaccine for 2 reasons. First of all, they didn't have any US data that they needed for the US. And secondly, with all the issues appearing in Europe, with blood clots, that has been called a safety issue, and many countries have stopped applying that vaccine, although it's approved in Europe. Yep. So we'll have to see what's going on with that. Hopefully it still goes through the US.
And we should see a very interesting month coming up. According to a Reuters report from a few days ago, AstraZeneca is planning to submit its vaccine for an EUA review as early as this week or early next month. We're also expecting Pfizer and BioNTech to submit their BLA for full licensure for their COVID-19 vaccine in April. They should have their 6-month data very, very soon, and probably Moderna not too far behind them. And as you were kind of indicating, that's going to be somewhat of a game changer, in particular because the EUA statute says that there are various conditions which allow a product to be marketed, but one of those is you cannot get an EUA unless, if there is another product that is both approved and available in sufficient quantities. And that may wind up limiting some subsequent or future vaccines that try and get to market. They may not have the EUA pathway available to them, but they may need to go directly to a BLA. So lots of interesting stuff there. Kirsten, another question for you. We've seen the FDA come out with some new guidance documents in the last month talking about emerging variants and kind of their effects on the efficacy of various medical products, including vaccines. Can you talk about how the FDA is thinking about the evaluation of products that are currently marketed, and also how it may kind of create new processes to maybe monitor some of these variants and update vaccines, similar to how it might do for the influenza vaccine?
Certainly I can. So during the last advisory committee meeting, which was on February 26th, we did have some speakers from the CDC speak about those new emerging variants, but really they are nothing old, because any virus is prone to mutating over time, and the faster it spreads, the faster it will mutate. So the emergence of variants was just a matter of time. Just to set that stage, that was kind of not a new thing. The FDA made clear that they're still going on a 50% efficacy requirement, with a lower end at 30% for some subgroups. So nothing has changed at the moment for the FDA, but of course, going forward, it will be important for all new sponsors that apply for the EUA to take into account those new variants and test against those. And Janssen, the most recently EUA, did test against those. I know that Pfizer and Moderna have gone back to test their vaccines about from the previous trial participants, but the efficacy for those is still a bit open and needs to be determined. But going forward, sponsors will have to look at the new variants that come out and how efficacious they are, and prove that the efficacy is there in order to get them approved for new variants. Going forward, I think it will likely look like a flu vaccine in the future, where you have to get a yearly vaccine, which might be multivalent, addressing various variants coming out. During the AdCom, they already discussed issuing booster shots. So if the Pfizer vaccine needed 2 shots, you probably have to get a booster shot after a year just to keep the efficacy up, if it's efficacious against the different vaccines. So there is a flux there on how this is going to be, but we know that the FDA has a very good system on monitoring flu strains that emerge and how to address them. It looks like COVID-19 is going to be an endemic that will be addressed similar to the flu in the future.
Yep. Well, moving on to an entirely different topic, or mostly different, Laura, I want to bring you back in because, Laura, we've seen quite a lot of interesting developments in the last few months, last year in particular, around real-world evidence. And this has been a topic of intense discussion and interest within, in particular, the pharmaceutical industry, but the medical device industry as well, for some years now. And the challenge has always been the FDA is being pushed by Congress to make broader use of it, by industry to make broader use of it, but it has some key hesitancies. It is reluctant to make broader use of it without understanding the data sets, some of the confounding factors. But it seems like the pandemic has really accelerated its acceptance and use of it within, let's say, narrow parameters. Can you talk a little bit about how it's being used, where there might be some opportunities, and how things might change in the future?
Sure thing. So the pandemic has really created a very unexpected silver lining of serving as a really robust proving ground for real-world evidence research and study methodology, especially as the pandemic and the response itself to the pandemic created challenges for more traditional research programs, which I know we'll be talking about a little later in the webinar. And one of the most robust proving grounds that we've actually seen is a collaborative between the FDA, Friends of Cancer Research, and the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA called the Evidence Accelerators, which serve as a platform for researchers, including academic, clinical, and industry research, to kind of pressure test each other's methodology in pre-competitive spaces to receive allowing them to get feedback and technical expertise as really experts in the field poke holes in each other's kind of methodology. And one of the major players in the evidence accelerators has been Principal Deputy Commissioner Amy Abernethy, who has attended the meetings and speaks very highly of the work being done. And another component of the FDA's own response has been, a use case for the Sentinel system, which is the FDA's own real-world data-based post-market surveillance system, which has been able to be very quickly repurposed into tracking existing and approved or authorized products through the market to really identify how, for example, existing therapeutics were being repurposed in pandemic response, and really how those things ended up working. So kind of an example of the pandemic use case of real-world data, there are over 150,000 post-COVID patients currently being tracked in a project that's discussed at the evidence accelerators to contextualize the natural history of post-COVID symptoms. And it's really almost mind-boggling to think of 150 people being kind of generated into a single data set and followed prospectively, and kind of the timing that we've been able to accomplish here.
Yeah, 150,000 person data set in the span of a year, all focused on one disease that did not exist really a year ago, is pretty remarkable. In terms of progress or validation or other things that you're tracking, where do you think the FDA is headed in the next few months or year?
Right. I mean, I think all of these projects are really going to be foundational to creating change at an agency level. As I mentioned, Principal Deputy Commissioner Amy Abernethy is very involved in the evidence accelerators, and therefore she has said that she's gaining more complete insight into what a robust methodology for RWE research really looks like from an FDA perspective. So we're expecting, as kind of a tangible deliverable out of these projects, we're expecting frameworks from the evidence accelerators, especially within the work stream. So something we've found to be kind of time and time again, what Abernethy herself and a lot of the stakeholders in the evidence accelerators are coming back to, is parallel analysis as just like a foundational portion of what makes RWE robust. So we're expecting those frameworks to come out, which once again, we expect to be kind of foundational to the way that the FDA perceives what makes RWE robust going forward. And of course, we're expecting guidance out of CBER and CDER this year, but a big pressure point that is both internal to the FDA, but also external in a very significant way, is the focus that the pandemic has put on data linking and data sharing, especially between different sources of data, like public health data, which belongs to the CDC, and clinical data, which in practice belongs to the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. So going forward, there's likely to be an increased focus on RWE as it exists kind of above the FDA's head, including at the HHS level. So that is something that could have impacts on the processes for life sciences validation kind of going forward.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Laura. Moving on into a little bit of a discussion on clinical trials. We've been working a little bit behind the scenes to see if we can get Kadesh to join us. Kadesh, is your audio working? I am sorry to hear that, but all right. So I'm going to be talking about clinical trials, I suppose. There was a recent meeting last week that featured Janet Woodcock, and there was a quote there that stood out to our entire team. And Woodcock has been talking about this for a little while. She first brought it up on, I think, a Friends of Cancer Research webinar a few months ago, and she's since published research on this. But the quote is that only about 5% of clinical trial arms are adequately powered to yield actionable information. And as we've seen throughout the pandemic, there have been hundreds, thousands even, of clinical trials for diagnostics, for therapeutics, for vaccines that have come out and tried to study, is investigational product X good at treating symptom of COVID-19. Why? And as we've seen, so many of these trials are they're small, they're not designed well, they have extraordinary limitations, they just have other design flaws. And as Woodcock was explaining, this is a massive kind of unforced error on the part of industry and the FDA and the NIH to not enforce some sort of method of determining, can we get better evidence that's better able to be compared against current standards of care? And the UK has actually done a really good job of this. They have an official over there, Martin Landry, who has developed a master protocol, I think it's called the recovery trial, which assesses head to head, is this product good or better than an existing product? And they've been able to determine with a pretty high degree of confidence whether or not people should be using hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir and under which scenarios and which patients. We haven't seen that to the same extent in the US, though we have seen efforts to build up master protocols through the active trials that the NIH has been running. So briefly here, for anyone on the call who doesn't know what a master protocol is, ordinarily in a clinical trial, you have one product that's being compared against either the current standard of care or a placebo. In a master protocol, you may have multiple products that are all being compared at the same time against that same placebo or standard of care. And it allows all of those products are being assessed based on the same endpoints and in the same types of patients and things like that. It makes for a clinical trial that's able to generate useful evidence so that you can determine which of these is best. According to Woodcock, though, too many of these trials are not set up in that way. Too many folks try to get their products into testing as quickly as possible. And as a result, we're still no closer to figuring out whether or not some of those products work. Whereas had they waited a little while longer and kind of standardized their clinical trials and protocol approaches, they would have gotten that. Another key thing that we're really looking at as it relates to clinical trials is just the impact of COVID-19 on trials. We've talked about this a little bit in some of our past webinars, but something that I think most people have not given enough thought to in terms of long-term effects on the FDA is almost every single clinical trial that was being run in 2020 was negatively affected by COVID-19. Trial sites needed to close. They had massive numbers of patients who either couldn't make it to clinical trial sites or some cases died. Some of them have the effects of long-term COVID. Some of them just dropped out of the study because they didn't want to be going to a hospital. Some hospitals didn't have enough space to actually accommodate them because the normal wards where they had the PPE were being converted into COVID wards. So huge disruption on the clinical trial side. But thinking long-term, how does this affect the FDA? That means that the FDA is all of a sudden going to be receiving tons of NDAs and BLAs for new products. And the data that they're receiving is not going to be up to where it has historically been. There's going to be an untold number of confounding factors, which are going to make it difficult for the FDA to say with confidence, yes, we believe that this product is safe and effective for its given purpose, and we agree with the sponsor that it ought to be approved. On the other hand, they may come back and say, listen, ordinarily this trial was set up correctly, but given the circumstance of what happened, we're going to need you to go back and run a second confirmatory study. Maybe it's smaller, but we just need to see in ordinary normal operating conditions, does this drug work as intended? Or was this just kind of the thing where we don't know if a whole bunch of patients dropped out because your drug is leading to really bad side effects, or if people dropped out because of COVID, or we don't know if people here experienced long-term side effects because of your product or because of long COVID. There's just so many X factors there that are going to be difficult. One other thing just to, let's move on in the interest of time. And I will remind folks, if you do have a question, please feel free to put that into our Q&A part. If you have the kind of gray window open at the side of the webinar where it says things like webcam and audio, all the way at the bottom, there should be a tab which says questions. You can use that to ask questions, and we'll be getting to those in just a few minutes. Now, we talked a little bit about master protocols. I think something else Woodcock has really emphasized is adaptive designs for trials that, especially early on in a pandemic, as you have lots of products that are being tested, you ought to prospectively design these studies such that if a product is not working, stop giving that to people, stop giving hydroxychloroquine to people in your study. have a washout period for those people who are receiving it, and then transition those patients into other arms of the study such that you can maximize the amount of data you're getting for the things that do work and minimize the exposure to harm for folks who are receiving things that did not work. And I don't know if it's really going to have too much of an effect in kind of our current approach to COVID, but certainly as we're developing the, let's say, response plans for the next pandemic, I think adaptive designs and master protocols are going to be two things that the FDA really focuses on. And it may be something for long-term tracking or development of therapeutics for COVID that we start to see a lot more emphasis, or at least private sector development by companies who are encouraging this sort of thing. Lily, I want to bring you in on this second part because you've done quite a lot of research for us on this topic of clinical trial diversity and patient diversity in trials. What have we been seeing during the pandemic, and what have we also seen before the pandemic? Is this something that the FDA cares about? Is it something that industry cares about?
Absolutely. I'll start from the beginning. So AgencyIQ has collected a significant amount of data related to particularly CDER NME clinical trial diversity breakdowns. And what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years are that clinical trials, for the most part, don't show strong racial parity with the US population. And this was highlighted by Janet Woodcock in the same webinar that we've discussed a couple of times before in this presentation last week. And I do want to highlight her quote specifically. She said, "We have to move clinical research out into the community if we're going to be successful in enrolling populations that look like this country." So like I said, data going back 5, 6 years is showing this parity problem. And it has been on FDA's mind for a similar amount of time. They've released guidance documents, other information in the last couple of years related to this and different types of trials, most specifically cancer trials and the diversity of those. But I think the pandemic has brought a greater emphasis to this issue. So we've seen that the pandemic has impacted certain communities more than others, and particularly racial minorities. And when we get the data back for these vaccine trials, what we're seeing is that those populations in many cases are not really strongly represented in the trial, which is, again, emphasizing this even more for the FDA. So now we have Janet Woodcock, the acting commissioner, coming out with strong statements like this. And I think moving forward, maybe shifting farther away from this guidance perspective of here are some suggestions for increasing trial diversity and how are we going to move research into a community setting where people can see their own providers and people they're familiar with for a trial, and also make trials more accessible to more people. And in some ways that goes back to the discussion that we just had on clinical trial designs. Decentralized trials can definitely help with accessibility in many cases.
Yep, well said. And I think just to add one thing there, I think FDA had actually worked with some clinical trial sponsors to extend the amount of data that they collected to ensure that there was better racial representation among marginalized communities who were not well represented in those trials. So ultimately, I think the data that was presented was fairly representative, but it did not start out that way and was not for lack of trying among some stakeholders. So one other thing that we've talked about in a lot of our existing webinars has been this issue of inspections and a tremendous backlog. The FDA in particular has found it really difficult to do inspections, either especially international inspections, where FDA has done almost none, domestic inspections, which were also severely curtailed. And there have been lots of companies in the last few months who have said, or put out statements rather, saying, hey, our product has either received what's known as a complete response letter, preventing it from being approved, or they've received a notice that their approval has been deferred until the FDA can conduct either a pre-approval inspection or a for-cause inspection or things like that. FDA is going to, I think, really struggle with this for quite a while, in part because it conducts lots of inspections every year. If it is a year behind schedule, there is a massive backlog of places that it wants to get into. I think what winds up being interesting is how does it deal with that backlog? Is it going to obviously prioritize certain ones over others? Which things get deprioritized? And are there other measures that it can take to kind of address some of those lesser priority facilities while still giving them some degree or amount of eyesight or checking their records to see, do we actually need to go in and inspect those? It would not surprise me if there's going to be a surge in compliance related findings in 2021, in particular warning letters or 483s, official action indicated, voluntary action indicated, as the FDA goes in. And companies, by the way, are dealing with, well, we made a bunch of changes as the result of the pandemic to keep our staff safe. FDA may be going in and saying, this is not, you didn't validate this. One example, if you have an ISO clean room and all of a sudden you put up some shields around stuff to prevent airflow or keep people 6 feet apart, if you didn't validate, air movement studies there to see how it was changing things, FDA may be sending you an inspection thing saying, hey, we need to see data for this. Now, is that going to be an official action indicated letter all by itself? Probably not. But at the same time, FDA is going to want to see you validate that. So we're expecting to see quite a bit more of that. Also, as some of these products have not been approved, we may actually see a surge of approvals in 2021. That isn't necessarily going to mean that like, hey, the FDA is back and it's, doing all these crazy things. It may just mean the FDA is finally caught up. And we've seen some of that historically with the FDA. I think it was back in 1994 or so. If you look at historical approval trends, all of a sudden it's like, wow, the FDA approved like 50 something drugs that year. Well, it's because there was a huge backlog because PDUFA wasn't yet in effect. So we may see some interesting trends there as well. Probably the same for medical devices and other things as well there. So Laura, let me bring you in here because we've also been talking a lot about supply chains during the pandemic. Laura, just let me know her internet is a little wonky, so may need to jump in on this myself. As I said at the outset of the webinar, we've been having all sorts of tech issues today. Laura, we saw early on as SARS-CoV-2 kind of exited out of China and there was a lot of realization all of a sudden that like, oh my gosh, a lot of our essential medical products are no longer made in the US. Rather, they're made in whole or in part in some of these other countries. And the FDA doesn't necessarily have really good insight into that. Congress, though, has stepped in to give the FDA some additional authority. Laura, can you talk a little bit about maybe what has happened so far and what else we're looking for?
Absolutely. So I can't necessarily see myself, but I'm just going to trust that you can all hear me. So under the CARES Act, which is now at this point a year old, FDA gained new authority, which it had previously never had before, to require medical device manufacturers, and this includes, as Alec was saying, things like PPE manufacturers, to report to the agency on current supply chain pressures in much the same way that they currently have this authority for non-device regulated industry. So over the past year, the FDA has worked to stand up that new authority, issuing a couple of guidance documents. However, as we know, the FDA's work to stand up oversight of shortages and those kinds of policies is really long-term and usually constantly in development. So the agency has only had this authority for devices for a year. And it's been a rather unusual year. So exactly what these requirements look like in a day-to-day that is not a pandemic will still really need to be considered in a very long-term fashion. But also, on a longer-term basis, the FDA was given authority similar to what it currently has for pharmaceuticals, for example. This is not necessarily the direction that the FDA has wanted to go. They've been looking to develop more database systems that are anticipatory, rather than relying on reports from a manufacturer that a pressure or a disruption is already in progress. So we've already seen the FDA has a pilot program that utilizes artificial intelligence to kind of certify hotspots in the food supply chain and pressures there. So in a looking forward perspective, there is some movement towards trying to get a similar model moved out into regulated life sciences, rather, that has been proven in the food process.
Yeah, and we're seeing, I think, too, on the pharma side, a lot of those same things, but something too, it feels like the FDA is much more attentive to where constituent parts of these essential products are being made, knowing that it's not just about the whole product and whether that's in shortage, but if you know that a constituent part of a product is, not available, that means that sooner or later, maybe multiple products are going to be in shortage. And
Absolutely.
FDA has been asking a lot more for information related to that, and also requiring companies to come up with kind of pandemic response plans that take into account the possibility of that happening. Lily, I want to bring you in on the second part, because early on in the pandemic, kind of speaking of shortages, there were shortages of things like hand sanitizer, and the FDA kind of said, you know what, let's think about new ways where we can bring new entrants into the market, have folks like distilleries make some of this. However, things have not quite gone according to plan, and there's been some interesting developments. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened and what we're seeing now?
Yeah, the OTC case study here is super interesting. So you talk about hand sanitizer being in shortage. That is an over-the-counter drug product regulated by the FDA. So essentially what happened is in March, because we were experiencing this shortage of hand sanitizer, the FDA had an enforcement discretion policy that allowed groups like distillers, basically places that are not traditionally over-the-counter drug manufacturers, to produce hand sanitizer in order to fulfill the need of the country at that time. And all those groups had to do was register with the FDA in order to be able to do that. 1 week after this enforcement discretion policy is put in place, the CARES Act, as Laura just discussed, was passed. And yes, so much information in that about coronavirus relief, but it also passed over-the-counter monograph reform and really overhauled the over-the-counter drug process and their paths to market. And it gave FDA the right to collect user fees for these products. This includes facility fees. So fast forward to December, when FDA put out their fiscal year 2021 over-the-counter drug facility user fees for, like I said, that fiscal year. And it turned out that those facilities, these distilleries who stepped up to the plate to create hand sanitizer during the shortage, would owe the FDA these facility fees. There was obviously a lot of backlash from that, and ultimately HHS ended up withdrawing FDA's announcement and claimed the FDA had released it improperly. So that's the whole story, super interesting, but the implications of this are that the over-the-counter industry is left in a little bit of a state of limbo, as are these distillers, since no update to this policy has been made. We still don't know what the fiscal year 2021 fees will be. And additionally, this is the first year of OMUFA, of the over-the-counter drug user fee program. They're just starting to stand it up. We know how complicated this is, from PDUFA being stood up, GDUFA being stood up. And we just don't really know the butterfly effect that this one very small enforcement discretion policy might have on all of these new over-the-counter drug overhauls being put in place.
FDA works with the distillers, and all of a sudden the over-the-counter drug user fee program collapses. It's, as you said, an interesting butterfly effect there. So in the interest of time, I want to remind folks we've got about 5 minutes left. We've gotten a few questions in that I'll be happy to answer, so I want to make sure that I can get to your questions. What we've heard today is, I think, that there have been a lot of changes in the pandemic, and those changes are going to have long tail effects that are going to affect industry and the FDA, not only this year, but in many cases for years to come. Already in the pandemic, we've seen FDA taking various actions, some which are intended to accelerate the movement of medical products, regulation and reviews, things like the use of guidance templates, the speed of FDA product reviews, adopting some measures like the real-time oncology review program, a lot of flexibility too, including the use of decentralized trials, instead of requiring people to come in to physically attend a trial, instead allowing them to do some of those things from their home with the use of validated wearables and digital biosensors. And also FDA has just been mostly flexible. I don't think I've ever seen in my life as many enforcement guidance documents come out in 1 year as I have this year, like probably as more this year as I've seen in the last decade combined. So these are all accelerators. On the other hand, we've also seen plenty of things where the FDA has slowed down quite a lot. Things like FDA not being able to inspect certain facilities due to travel restrictions, delays for certain non-COVID-19 products, like we've seen, especially in the diagnostics and medical device space. Lots of delays as well for guidance and regulations. As the medical device industry knows well, FDA has been planning for a long time to shift over from the quality system regulation to something called ISO 13489. That's an international quality standard that's widely used by EMA and other regulators. That's been delayed a bunch of times during the pandemic. While it's supposed to come out this year, it would not surprise me if it doesn't come out until very late this year or even early next year. We've also seen disruptions in hiring efforts, as Lily was talking about with the OTC program. FDA can't exactly hire new staff. It isn't able to collect user fees that fund the hiring of those new staff. So lots of things that have kind of disrupted business as usual. Now, that being said, there are still a lot of key questions that we have. And actually, some of the questions that we've had come in, I think, are perfectly described by some of these. So thanks for sending those in. One that we've gotten before the webinar was, how is the FDA going to handle the backlog of inspections and product application submissions? That's a great question. I don't know if it's going to be uniform across multiple different centers. It strikes me that probably the effects here are going to be uneven. CDRH was hit very early on with the surge in applications, whereas other divisions like CBER and CDER have been a little bit less affected, but may be affected more over time, since the scope and speed of product development for drugs and biologics just naturally takes longer. And many of the products that we've seen already approved or reviewed, those were things that were already in late stage testing, like remdesivir, which was originally, I believe, developed for Ebola. So that was able to go through very quickly. But what FDA said is they have hundreds and hundreds of INDs, investigational new drug applications, to initiate clinical trials that they're now reviewing. So probably this year and next year, they're going to see a wave of product applications for BLAs and NDAs that's really going to slow things down. The other thing that we've heard a lot about is when, as I was saying earlier, when companies have data gaps due to the pandemic, when they start submitting their NDAs or BLAs, how is the FDA going to respond to that? As I said earlier, I think FDA is probably going to require, in some cases, additional studies. That's going to add additional time, additional cost, and additional complexity to companies that, in some cases, if you're a large cap pharma company, you might be able to swallow those costs. If you're a smaller cap company, though, you may have been planning or budgeting on, like, we have just enough to get over the finish line and not enough for an additional study. That could be ruinous to you under the wrong circumstances. And I'm going to expect a lot more companies to be filing up with FDA's ombudsman and saying, no, that you can't give us a CRL. That's the wrong decision. See, we did everything right. And just look past this little thing and you'll see that this looks fine. So we may see a more tumultuous, acrimonious review process and kind of company FDA interactions starting to return later on in the pandemic. In the interest of time, and to give Colleen a little bit of time to just send us off here at the end, I'll pick one more thing here, and that is, what changes will Congress want the FDA to make? And there are key stakeholders here, Congress, as it relates to the FDA. There are some big pieces of legislation coming up, including the user fee reauthorizations. We have the 21st Century Cures Act 2.0. We have drug pricing legislation that's coming up, in addition to other pandemic-related things. There are a lot of different stakeholders that are going to say, FDA should have done this early on in the pandemic, and I want to make sure that never happens again, and therefore we're instituting this. Lots of changes. Congress, I think, is going to be acutely interested in making long-term, larger systemic changes to the agency. And that's going to mean that there are going to be, again, to use this term again, downstream effects on other companies, both intended effects and unintended effects. So, Colleen, let me bring you back in here because we have some cool things to share if people are interested as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much, everyone, again, for joining us today. Couple quick updates. One, everyone will be receiving the slides via email, but if you would like them more immediately, you can email me at cconnolly@agencyIQ.com and I will send those your way. The recording will also be available along with the slides for everybody tomorrow via email. We also do have a free newsletter called the FDA Today, which we would love to have everyone on the line subscribing to. So if that is of interest, please do email me, as we'd be happy to get you up and running. And if you have any other questions regarding AgencyIQ, please don't hesitate to reach out. But with that, we're a minute after the hour, so I will let everyone go. And thank you to the AgencyIQ research team for guiding us through today's presentation. Hope you all have a great afternoon.